In this audio lecture, we're going to continue talking about the functional area of communication and how we support oral language development. The first thing we need to consider is that children have to be exposed to language through interaction in order to develop an understanding of speech patterns and rules. Children are not born able to speak, but they are born desiring social interaction. So even before they're able to use words, infants are crying and gesturing in order to convey meaning and get across what it is they need or want. The point of this is then to be able to communicate but interact socially. It's not necessarily to master those speech patterns and rules, but to at least make sense of the experiences that they're having around them. Then later on, children are able to develop more of an understanding of speech patterns and rules. The amount of time that children spend communicating with adults is correlated to the later literacy skills that they will acquire. This is evident because of the fact that children have their own linguistic rules that they use before they're able to pick up the adult forms of it, such as I see your feet instead of I see your foot. Eventually, they learn the conventional forms as they sort it out for themselves, along with the exceptions to the rules of our language and that particular syntax. But let's start back from the beginning. So we already mentioned that communication begins with gestures. Around 18 to 24 months is when you're going to start seeing evidence that the children are actually able to combine the words that they have been learning and hearing the past year, year and a half, or 2 years of life. So you're going to see this where they're combining simple words such as I do or no, that's mine, those types of things in the classroom. So we really want to continue to build on this through beneficial conversations. Talk to children about what they've experienced in the immediate past, what they might experience in the immediate future, or more importantly, what's happening in the present. The best thing you can do as a teacher is to talk about and communicate what your intentions are with the children and what's happening directly around them. As they get older, you can start talking a little bit more about imaginary events as their creative minds and their ability to think more abstractly becomes evident. An important piece of this is that you're having a balance of input, meaning that we need to treat children as if they are conversationalists, even if they're not yet talking. Children learn very early on about how conversations work and that we have to take turns, we need to look attentive, we use facial expressions, and we provide pauses in order for those to respond back to us. So having that balance of input not only is respectful, but encourages the child to attempt to make conversation back with us. Having extended conversation encourages more interaction and more understanding of the language. You're introducing vocabulary, you're extending on those experiences, and most importantly, you're more able to contribute to the connections that they're already creating. So going back to vocabulary, sometimes we have to be intentional with our vocabulary introduction. Things are going to come up that children are going to ask questions about and look to you for answers. My suggestion is this: think about it beforehand and try to come up with a way that can explain it to the child, but still making sure that it's politically correct. A good example of this is death. Many children want to understand what death is. If the question is asked to me, what does death mean? I usually respond with that death means someone's body goes to sleep and never wakes up because the body is either too old, too sick, or too hurt to get better. This keeps it straightforward and still answers the child's question without overstepping my bounds in regards to a family's culture, tradition, or beliefs. The last thing that you will need to consider in regards to a beneficial conversation are good active listening skills. Practice this sometime. it's really a lot harder than you think. Active listening is when you're able to draw the connections and summarize what it is someone has said to you. So if I were to ask you to summarize back to me what we have just discussed in regards to the key elements for beneficial conversations with children, could you do it without having to go back and re-listen to this? If you were actively listening, you would have no problem with it, as you picked up the key point that this lecture has presented. If you were not active listening, you'd have to rewind this lecture. So let's look at oral language in a young infant classroom. Here you have a teacher with an infant on her lap. She's most likely speaking softly to him. She's describing to him that he's having his bottle, that his milk is nice and warm, and helping him make connections of what's going on around him. She's providing time for him to respond, so as you can see, when I came in to take this picture, he sat up and looked inquisitive as to what I was doing. She allowed him to stop feeding on his bottle and take that moment to make eye contact with me and have a brief conversation. You can also use calm background sounds or music, as well as singing in the classroom in order to promote the oral language. For older infants or mobile infants, model their language attempts. So if a child is smiling, such as in the picture here, smile back to them. If a child coos or makes sounds at you, mimic them back, and then provide time for their response. While baby talk and cooing are appropriate, you want to make sure that you're also incorporating use of proper language. So if the child has a bowel movement, tell them, oh, you had a bowel movement today, or we're going to mix your bottle, we need to mix the formula with the water. That way you're not necessarily putting a cute spin on it so that the child knows exactly what it is, and it helps make the connection with what the proper term is with what actually happened that much stronger. Bring in poems, stories, and other songs along with other experience to continue promoting all of the wonderful things that you're doing in the classroom. For toddlers, you're going to really need to start scaffolding their language and elaborating and expanding on their speech. This particular group in the picture had started learning sign language as a means to communicate what their needs and wants were. As you can see, the teacher is using sign language, but also using her oral language back with them so that they can connect that the sign for more also means more in the oral language. Going back to new vocabulary and ways that children understand, for a toddler age group who doesn't necessarily have oral language yet, sign language, music, body language, or gestures are all other ways that you can help them communicate their needs, whether this is in a silly, lively, personal, or repetitive manner. Reading books is another way to be able to help build those connections and introduce vocabulary, because the books that we're typically reading to toddlers have the pictures so they can connect the spoken word with the picture story. Preschool conversations. So this is important also for in the infant room, but this is most important in the preschool classroom, and that we need to be modeling conversations that are appropriate with other adults. Preschoolers really see how we're conversing with one another and will model their conversations with each other after how we do. So we want to make sure that we're providing a positive model of conversation, as well as scaffolding their language, and meaning that we provide them clues or asking questions to help them connect with what it is they need, want, or feel, and being able to communicate that to others. What you might do is discuss with them how you feel about certain situations and being honest with them. Now, when I say that, take it with a grain of salt, because how you might feel in working with children is how my dad looks in the picture. But the reaction that my father is having is not what you want to do. We need to make sure that we're being fair in our response with them. We want to make sure that we're treating children respectfully and we're encouraging interaction so that they can help negotiate what it is they need, want, and how they're feeling with others. If we tend to react, such as this, then we're not telling the child that it's okay to feel sad and problem solve for another solution so that the child can learn what's more of a reasonable approach. Moving on to vocabulary development, there are 4 different types of components when learning vocabulary. The first is phonological, or the rules for combining sounds. The second is the semantic component, which is made of the smallest units of meaning that can be combined to make up other words. For example, if you have a paper plus an S, which is papers. The next is syntactic, or when you're combining 2 words to convey meaning. And the last is the pragmatics, which deals with the rules of language. The rules of language can differ in many situations depending on where you're living and the type of language that you're using in the setting, such as a more conversationalist setting at home versus a more formal setting such as a job interview. Vocabulary development is most closely linked with reading comprehension. The more vocabulary a child can develop, the better the reading comprehension they're going to have in the longer run. So a typical conversation is about 15,000 words. And in that conversation, usually less than 0.5% of those words are considered sophisticated. But something else to think about is how socioeconomic status can greatly affect the types of conversations as well as the vocabulary being used. So typically, a child from a family of a lower socioeconomic status has less sophisticated vocabulary than a child from a middle or upper class family. So if you're working with children from a lower socioeconomic status, really try as best you can to introduce new and sophisticated vocabulary as frequently as you can. Phonological awareness consists of skills that typically develop gradually and sequentially through the late preschool period. They're usually developed with direct training and exposure. So what do I mean by that, and how do we teach it? There are 4 skills to phonological awareness. The first is awareness of sounds in a language. So understanding the letters and the sounds that they make helps us to pinpoint and breaking down a word so that we can sound it out. Second is awareness of rhymes. Looking at words that have ending sounds that are similar, such as king and ring, or bake and make. This helps us to establish different sounds with words so that they're more easily recognizable when we're sounding them out. Third is the awareness that sentences can be broken down into words, syllables, and sounds, and that we have the ability to talk about, reflect, and manipulate those sounds. Last but not least is the understanding that the relationship between the written and spoken language is very much interconnected. Now that we've talked about the different skills in regards to phonological awareness, let's talk about some basic ideas in regards of how to teach it in line of appropriate practices. Remember when we talked about appropriate practices being not about what's right or wrong, but about the best way to involve the children in learning? And we also talked about that children learn through hands-on manipulation of materials and exploration of the environment. Well, teaching phonological awareness follows these same principles. As you can see in the picture, there is a book that the children had been enjoying during a group time, as well as different sight words from the book, trays, and magnetic letters. This way, the children are able to connect what they've already heard to make the association that combining the letters will make the words from the book. This is one way that the children can play around with the letters in creating new words come up with words that might rhyme with it, and break them apart to really think about the sounds that they're making by themselves as well as when they're put together. Some other activities may include having pictures or the actual object along with the name cards and the letters for the children to spell out. Or you could use dry erase boards with dry erase markers, or even as simple as crayons and paper for them to be able to create stories. I also liked to include what I called a letter bin in my writing area. The letter bin had 26 separate compartments, and I would print off both capital and lowercase letters in the same font so that the children could pull them out and create with them. I've also used sound bins, and that I would take recyclable containers with lids, maybe about the size of a small sour cream jar, and put materials that started with a particular letter all together. Then this way, as the child is manipulating it and we're talking about what each object is, we can also talk about the commonality and that they all start with the same letter, but maybe the letter is said differently depending on the other letters surrounding it. When it comes to phonological awareness in the classroom, your materials are really only about 50% of the learning curve, and the other 50% is how you are helping the children to approach it. So it's capitalizing on those teachable moments and talking with them to help them understand and make the connections that the letters make sounds, that the sounds can be manipulated, and that the letters and sounds will make up words, and words make up sentences. Speech and language delays amongst children with special needs are actually the most common. And one of the easiest ways that we can help children with speech and language delays is by observing and creating good written records of what it is they're saying and how they're communicating. Then what we can do is use similar strategies as to the things that we've already discussed and how we support oral language and creating a supportive environment, but we can include others as well that are more directly in line with the things that we're noticing. However, if you have noticed a speech or language delay with a child, please make sure you're bringing the parents in so that you can collaborate together on a best plan moving forward. That way, if the parent decides the child needs some more formal intervention, they're able to seek out those services. Many times, the therapists who are providing those services can also give us some ideas and resources for how to implement the strategies that they're receiving in therapy into the classroom so that you're providing more consistency for that child. Last but not least, let's conclude what we've discussed in these 2 audio lectures for the first part of the functional area of communication. First, we talked about what communication is and why it's important. We also talked about how to promote a literacy and language-rich environment and supporting oral language through conversations and techniques based on the child's age. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to post them in the corresponding discussion board.